This happened ages ago when I used to babysit. I was maybe 13, living in the countryside, and was babysitting for most of the children in my street, about 20 houses max. This particular neighbor loved to go out on Wednesday because there was a Latin dance class going on in a nearby bar, so I was used to babysitting for her and knew she'd always come back very late. That specific night, the oldest, of 3, was a little difficult and didn't want to go to sleep. I struggled with putting him to bed, and afterwards, I was tired. I studied my math for a little while, and around midnight, I decided to take a nap until the kid's mom came back. A few minutes after falling asleep, I heard someone frantically knocking on the door, trying to open it. It was the neighbor with her 2 young children. It was winter, and we easily had 3 feet of snow. The kids only had their pajamas on and an unzipped jacket, and she was wearing jeans, a wool shirt, and winter boots. I could see the fear in her eyes as I struggled to unlock the door. I panicked and had her walk all the way around the house to the patio door. When she got in, she quickly told me to bring all the children downstairs, turn off the lights, and not answer the door to anyone. The kids kept asking, "Who is Daddy going to kill? Who is Daddy going to kill?" And she kept muting them, saying nothing was going to happen, and then she left. I woke up all the kids, brought them into the playroom in the basement, and asked them to play quietly. The oldest, who hadn't been asleep for long, was asking what was going on, and I kept telling him it was a special occasion where he could play late with his neighbor friends. I calmed down the 2 other kids, telling them no one was going to die, but in my mind, my time had come. I could see myself being shot while trying to protect the kids. I was trying to figure out how to stay alive, or at least how to keep them alive. I wasn't trying to be a hero, but I was trying to convince myself that if it came down to that, I would have to try and protect them. I called 911, but I started shaking and crying so much I didn't know what to do. It was an answering machine asking if I wanted the cops, the ambulance, or firefighters. I called my mom, told her quickly what was going on, and she called the cops and joined me. As she got into the driveway, the neighbor's husband was walking up the street with a huge axe. My mom got into the house, locked the door, and cracked open a window, asking what was going on while he was approaching the house. He asked her to come out and confront him, thinking she was his wife. My mother then explained to him that she was the babysitter's mother and had come after receiving a worried call from her 13-year-old daughter. He then asked us to give him his wife's whereabouts, but we didn't know where she was. He argued a little with my mom, but she remained so calm that it calmed him down. I still admire her for that night. After about 15 minutes of arguing, he walked back home carrying his axe, and a few seconds later, his wife knocked on the patio door behind the house and came in. She was crying and apologizing to my mother for the whole situation. She thought her neighbor was home, not the babysitter. My mother asked me to go check on the kids while she took care of the wife. A few minutes later, 2 police cars arrived, and the officers came in, spent time with the wife, asking tons of questions, and then interviewed me and my mother. In the meantime, the woman I was babysitting for arrived, and they interviewed her too. They asked me and my mom if we were ready to go to court if the woman pressed charges against her husband, but surprisingly, she never did. Turns out she had just told her firefighter husband that she was sleeping with her boss in order to get a raise because they were struggling financially. He got his firefighting axe and said he was going to kill the man, but she wanted to stop him. That's why she brought the kids and left. I was always scared of him afterwards, and whenever I saw his children, I would check if they had any signs of violence, but they moved about 6 months later. When I was in high school, I babysat on the odd occasion for a family I'd known since I was pretty young. They were great, really laid back, and it was the easiest babysitting job in the world because the kids would usually be in bed before I got there and always slept really well. It had been about a year since I'd babysat for them, and in that time, they'd had a new baby who was about 6 months old. So on this occasion, it was me, 3 kids downstairs, and 1 baby sleeping upstairs. I should really mention before anything that their house was completely amazing. It wasn't the flashiest, but it was huge, and although it was in a suburban street, it was positioned on a hill, so from the master bedroom upstairs you could look out over the whole city. They had tons of CDs, which back then was really exciting for me. The kitchen was always full, and the whole place was decorated like a gallery. Amazing art, brilliantly designed, and really spacious, that sort of thing. They always had interesting stuff around too. That night I noticed in the front room, amongst the kids' stuff, there was a fake samurai sword. I remember laughing at it, thinking it looked too real to be a toy and waving it around a bit. It didn't surprise me. They were interesting people, and I was always finding things I liked. The layout of the house was cool too. The front door opened almost directly into the living room, and off to the side, we had the two kids' bedrooms, and then a staircase leading upstairs to the parents' bedroom. The living room was fantastic, with giant windows overlooking the front garden and almost the entire street. The middle part of the house was completely open plan, with the kitchen and dining room spread out for what seemed like miles. Near the back of the house, they even had a small study, which was more like a reading nook. From memory, it was just an armchair and 2 walls of books. That part is important because the night this happened, that's where I was hanging out. I'd been dropped off by my parents around 8:30, and the mom and dad left soon after, telling me the kids were fast asleep and that if I had any problems with the baby, I could wake their eldest daughter, who was good at settling him and would help me if I needed it. I remember being comforted by that because I knew virtually nothing about babies. I didn't need to in the end because the kids slept fine. But the important thing is, I felt safe, at ease. They told me they would be back around 1 a.m. and to call if I needed anything. I wasn't worried. I'd done this countless times before, and even though it was a cold night with a harsh wind, I knew this house. I knew the kids would sleep. I knew nothing would happen. I felt completely at home. I felt so safe, actually, that when I had trouble locking the screen door after they'd gone, I didn't stress too much about it. I thought maybe it was jammed or something. I didn't have a key to the front door, and usually the screen door shut just fine. They lived in a good neighborhood, though, and it didn't occur to me at the time that it was anything to worry about. I quickly forgot about it and went to the study to read after quickly peeking in on the kids. I lost track of time for a while. I didn't have a mobile phone when I was 16, and there was no clock in the reading nook. I was totally lost in a book, and before I knew it, a couple of hours had gone by. But it wasn't realizing the time that woke me from my reading stupor. It was nothing at all, and that's what was so frightening. I'd been deep in the book, and then all of a sudden looked up and felt such a sense of dread. Suddenly everything seemed more quiet. Then I heard the wind, and unease and fear washed over me, so much so that I felt reluctant to move. I didn't understand. I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I thought as I stared at the books on the walls that maybe I'd just been sitting too long. So I got up and slowly wandered into the kitchen with the intent of checking on the kids and then maybe watching some TV. The front living room was in darkness, and as I stepped into it on my way to the bedrooms, something stopped me dead in my tracks. With the light of the kitchen illuminating me from behind, I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of a man standing in the front garden. He didn't move, and I didn't either. I could see that he had shut the garden gate behind him, and from his position in the garden, it was clear he'd been walking toward the front door that was unlocked. I didn't know what to do. A million thoughts overwhelmed me. I had no weapon. The door was open. I couldn't get to the kids downstairs and the baby upstairs at the same time. He was huge, and I was small. I was lit, and he was in darkness. I knew if I didn't do something, he would come inside and get us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the fake samurai sword. And very slowly, bending down slightly but not taking my eyes off the figure in the garden, I picked it up and raised it in the air above my head. I don't know why, but I couldn't think of anything else. And after what seemed like an eternity, he turned and slowly walked towards the gate, opened it, and walked away down the street. It was only then I saw the glint of something at his side, something he'd hidden in one hand as he'd stood staring into the house. I stood there for a long time watching him walk away. And then I ran to the front door and leaned against it, forcing it shut against an intruder that was no longer there. I was 16, and I was stupid. I never called anyone. I stayed that way until the parents got home, and I never told them what happened. I never told anyone for a long time. I thought everyone would blame me for putting the kids in danger, and then I convinced myself that it was nothing, and maybe I just overreacted. The family today are fine and well, and nothing ever happened to them or their house after that night. But I have always been thankful for that moment of intense dread that caused me to leave the study, because if I hadn't, I don't even let myself think of how differently that night would have gone. So, man in the garden, I hope the fake sword was enough to scare you away from lurking outside people's houses in the night. I don't even know where to start this story. I was kind of young at the time, around 7 or 8, but old enough to know what was going on. I lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, but my family was in the process of moving. There was a large mixture of families with children and retired seniors living on my street. There was a neighborhood babysitter who took care of my younger sister when she was too young to go to school. She also happened to babysit me on multiple occasions. She was always kind of rude, a pudgy lady with 2 annoying sons and a very weird husband. A lot of kids got taken care of by her, so my parents trusted her to take care of us. Everything was somewhat normal, except for the fact that she was kind of rude to anybody that wasn't her kid. Her kids were pretty misbehaved. They were always fighting, hitting each other with plastic swords, and screaming at the top of their lungs. At one point, the younger toddlers had a nap, and she forced all of the children to sit in a corner and be quiet, besides her kids. Odd behavior for a babysitter, but we never thought much about it. Another thing to mention is that she took naps while babysitting, as in she didn't pay attention to the kids, she just shooed them away and fell asleep. She was also notorious for giving her sons chocolate milk and telling others they had to have water. My sister and I tried to ignore it, but eventually we were kind of annoyed. My sister had a loud mouth, so she told my mom about how she treats the kids she babysits versus her own children. I'd also like to acknowledge that my sister had just turned 4, so she wasn't great with words. My mom was angry that the babysitter did that, but let it slide, as we were moving in a month, and she didn't know if we were being completely honest. The house we moved to is the house I spent a large majority of my childhood and teen years in. Things were normal once we transitioned into the new house, until we got the calls. We changed our phone numbers, so we weren't sure how the babysitter and her husband found it so quickly. She called every day, saying that we needed to pay her and that we owed her money. She was just angry that we had moved and were currently on the lookout for a babysitter that was closer to home. My parents received these calls every day, and they consisted of the babysitter or her husband screaming, which meant that I could hear the calls quite clearly. They kept harassing us, and my parents grew agitated and worried. It all ended one night at around 10 p.m. when my sister and I woke up to the sound of banging on the front door. It continued for a good 10 minutes, and it was very loud. My sister was freaked out, so I decided to go see if my parents were awake. They were. They were just opening their eyes, kind of confused as to what was going on. My dad told my mom to stay upstairs, and he foolishly went downstairs to get the door, as I stood at the railing nervously. My sister stayed in the bedroom because she was unaware as to what was actually happening. When he opened the door, I felt sick and terrified. There was my babysitter and her husband, who managed to find not only our address but also our phone number. The husband started screaming at the top of his lungs, "You owe us money, pay us," and shaking a knife. Yes, he had a knife in his hand. My dad told him that we didn't and warned him to leave, unless he wanted the cops to be called. He didn't care. My dad went to close the door, but he stuck his foot in it, attempting to get inside. My babysitter was also yelling, but I couldn't hear what she had said. We had a phone upstairs, so my mother quietly called the cops as my dad struggled to get the door closed. Once he did, the banging and screaming continued. They wouldn't leave our property. I was freaked out, so I started crying. My sister saw me crying and she did the same. Long story short, about an hour later they left, and the cops arrived, having just missed them. My parents knew their info, based on the fact that they babysat us, so it wasn't hard to track them, and they were arrested. I always wondered if their children were home alone or at a sleepover, especially at a time so late. Regardless, they were released a few days later, but were not allowed to step foot near our house. I'm not sure if the woman still babysits, but if she does, I feel terrible for the kids. We never really knew what their intentions were that night. My dad saw the knife and knew that they were up to no good.